a physicist citing a historian, and I've made the case for bias and for questioning any scientific studies with that anti-fat bias, but I haven't actually disproved any science. Because to do that, I'd need to bring on an expert with formal training. With that in mind, let's talk to registered dietitian and fellow YouTuber, Dietitian Kat Benson.
Hello.
Hi there, Kat. So, is obesity correlated with mortality and negative health outcomes, or is that just bias?
Part of that is yes, part of that is no. When I'm talking about, let's say, the health at every size movement, I will always get the comments, well, you can't be healthy at every size. Like, what if you can't move, or what if you can't get up or do anything like that? Or they'll say also on the flip side, like, what if you don't have anything on you and you're just, very, very at a low weight? And to that, I say, like, well, okay, no shit, Sherlock. There are going to be those outliers. There is going to be that range. That is not what health at every size means, though. When you look at the principles for health at every size, it's not, a lot of people will think that it automatically means healthy at every size. When that is not the trademark, that is not what it actually is. And so there is, though, a variety that we can have in body sizes, and have health along with that variety in body sizes. So there was a study several years back from the CDC, and it pretty much it came out overnight that more than 400,000 Americans die of overweight and obesity every year, and that soon may surpass smoking as a leading cause of preventable death. And that was out of JAMA, or the Journal of Medical Association, the American Medical Association. And that was taken by storm. Everybody started talking about it, just everybody citing.
How did they prove a causal relationship between obesity and mortality?
They were looking at the people with obesity, so people who were on the BMI at a higher number, so 30 and above. And they also looked at the overweight category as well. And all of the people who died from cardiovascular disease, hypertension, diabetes, things related generally, what people will relate to health, nutrition, physical activity, things of that nature. The concern or the problem was that using better methodology and going back through the data, the CDC epidemiologists actually reduced that estimate and determined that it was only associated with an excess of 26,000 deaths annually. So 26,000 versus 400,000 is quite a bit.
That's different. That's very different. And the better methodology, did it change the underlying assumption, which is the causal relationship between obesity and all of these other diseases? So, like, for example, did the better methodology still say, okay, if you died of diabetes or hypertension or something, that's clearly caused by obesity? Like, was that underlying assumption still there?
So when you go back to health at every size and those principles surrounding it, and what we know about even weight cycling, for example, we know that when people often go on diets, it won't be a long-term kind of thing, right? So we see people losing 10 pounds, gaining 15, losing 20, gaining 25, losing 30, gaining 35. A lot of times people end up dieting their way up. And we know that when you have that fluctuation in weight, that actually puts stress on the body. That can actually increase the risk of cardiovascular disease. And so if we're looking at a group of people at a higher weight who have cardiovascular disease, who have been on many diets and have dieted their way up, there is that question of how much of that is coming from all of that stress being placed on their body over and over again with that up and down weight cycling. And that's not even taking into account any of the social determinants of health.
Did they control for weight cycling when doing the results of this study in the original methodology, and did they do it in the improved methodology?
No. And this was back in around the 2000s, early 2000s. And so that is something that is coming up more as we continue to move forward in what health at every size looks like. We know that, yes, at the very end wide range, we can have some health issues. But we also know that we don't have to have as much of a narrow goal frame to have health. We can see people in the BMI overweight range, or even a little bit higher too, have really healthy blood glucose levels, cholesterol levels, high blood pressure levels. At the same time, when we're focused so much on those people at a higher weights and pathologizing them and their health, we miss the opportunity for a lot of healthy weight people, in quotes, that sometimes end up having diabetes, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, high cholesterol issues, and not knowing it until further along down when they could have learned about it earlier, but because they were at that, again, quote, healthy weight, that wasn't something that was really a concern. And so there is so much focus on the numbers of people with type 2 diabetes, cholesterol, hypertension, all of those metabolic issues at that higher weight, but that can also happen at people at a, quote, again, healthy weight as well.
So the stigma and stereotypes surrounding weight affect everybody negatively, not just heavier
Right.
people. They also affect thin or straight sized people as well.
Yeah, I like the way you mentioned that. It very much does.
I also had a question. I have read a couple studies that suggest that medical discrimination, encouraging dieting, and therefore usually weight cycling, and just the social stigma surrounding being fat could actually be worse for someone's health than the weight in general. So I guess my question is, even if we say that weight is a health factor and weight causes issues, which the science is not back on, and there are actually a lot of conflicting reports. And as you mentioned, the methodology of a lot of these reports is flawed. And when corrected, even when not sufficiently corrected, as you mentioned, even with that insufficient correction, it still shows that any correlation is still pretty small. Could it be that the stigma is worse than the weight, even if we say that the weight is bad, which again, we are not?
Absolutely. So this goes all the way back to the social determinants of health. You have all of those different areas that impact health. And when you look at it blown out, weight is just weight is just such a small point in the social determinants of health. And we have the stress and discrimination, social support systems or lack of those, social integration, community engagement. Those are so important for health outcomes overall. And so to me, the idea of just focusing, doctors just focusing on, or other health professionals just focusing on weight is such a losing battle, because it's not something that one can do, right? It's not an action. Weight loss is not something that you can just say that. It's what are we actually doing that we can break down into those practices, those skills, to build those skills to improve health, versus just telling someone lose weight. I mean, it's kind of, it doesn't really help.
Yeah.
It doesn't give them direction or anything. And at the same time, there's so many different ways that people can approach weight loss and have worse health depending on how they're doing it. Absolutely.
Yes. And some people have equilibrium weights that are higher than others. So, what would you suggest, like as a dietitian, if someone is concerned about their health and wants like some check-ins on themselves, like things they can do to improve their health that don't focus on weight loss? What would you suggest as a better alternative?
This is my favorite thing to talk about. So I love to go back to the health at every size principles. So when I am going back and forth with somebody who maybe is not a big fan of the idea of health at every size, I'll go back to the principles. And that usually helps them to kind of look at it again. And so that includes weight inclusivity. So accepting and respecting the inherent diversity of body shapes and sizes and rejecting that idolization or pathologizing of specific weights. There's also health enhancement in the principles. And there's a lot of people who hear health at every size and think that we're just kind of letting everything go. We're not worried about our health. We're not concerned about it at all. It's kind of where the concern trolling comes into play. But health enhancement, principle wise, is to support health policies that improve and equalize access to information and services and personal practices that improve human well-being, including attention to individual, economical, social, spiritual, emotional, and other needs. And so that is just, I think, the most positive way that we can help people with their health, because we're not taking health off the picture or out of the picture or anything. Within the principles too, we can also talk about nutrition kind of in a more gentle nutrition way, not having a diet as in, a lot of restriction or anything, but really promoting flexible, individualized eating based on their hunger, their satiety, their nutrient needs. Medical nutrition therapy can fit in here as well if they have any kind of specific medical needs with nutrition, and also pleasure. And we're doing that rather than having this kind of externally regulated plan focused on weight control. So still very much focused on their well-being, their enjoyment, their health. When we can have that more intentional approach and really choose those foods that are going to help them feel good, help nourish them, but take away all of those kind of diet restriction kind of style implementation, then that's really helpful. And along with the principles too, we talk about life enhancing movement. So instead of telling them spend an hour on the treadmill or anything like that, what we're doing is really trying to find a way for them to find what is the most joyful kind of movement so that they can do it, have fun with it. They are more likely to stick with it. They're more likely to actually engage with it consistently. And we know that that does have an impact on health. And so helping them to choose enjoyable movement to the degree that they choose is really important for their engagement in there. And then of course, respectful care. So acknowledging our biases and working to end weight discrimination, weight stigma, weight bias is really important when we are going into those kind of one-on-ones or doing any kind of health education.
I really like the focus you have on sustainability, because as someone who has tried many times to get into fitness, yes, running on the treadmill for an hour is better than taking a half-hour walk. However, running on the treadmill for an hour every day for 1 week and then never again is nowhere near as good than going for a walk for an hour every so often, or a bike ride a few times a week, or going swimming. Like, something that you do for the rest of your life is always going to be better than something you just did for a week.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Same thing with your nutrition intake, with your food intake. If we're having this kind of very restrictive plan, not having any kind of joy in the food really, then how long is that going to last? I always talk about, I talk about MLMs quite often, but with their programs, one of my questions is, how long are we going to have to purchase this kind of shake or this supplement? Is this something that this company wants you to purchase for the rest of your life? If so, that is a red flag. Because if you are doing something and then you stop doing it, if you haven't changed anything else, you're going to go back to kind of older habits.
Even if you aren't making money by scamming your downline, you're still making money by scamming people who are trying to be healthy, which
right.
Double dipping on the scam.
Yeah. And what's even worse are the founders, because they know what is going on. They know all of the numbers on the back end.
The wild thing for me about the diet industry, like not even just MLMs, but the entire diet industry as a whole, is that it's been around. Like, I think the first diet guru, I call him a diet priest because he was like the OG Gwen Shamblin. He got popular in the 1700s, like the early 1700s. And it's wild to me that the diet industry has been around trying, like promising that they could get people to lose weight, promising weight control.
Yes.
And always advertising being pretty more than advertising health. Like health benefits is always a side thing. Like the thing they're really selling is beauty. You could be beautiful too.
Yes.
And if any diet ever worked, the entire industry would collapse.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So
that
logically, that's 300 years of diets that have not worked. And people are still falling for it. Like, and it's not the fault of these people. Like,
no, not at all.
Like, I'm not going to victim blame anyone who has been told by a doctor, however you lose the weight, it doesn't matter, it needs to come off, because they are trying to follow their doctor's instructions. And so they're falling for all of these scams that, even if you step back and think, they just don't work. Like, and any diet,
it'll work. If it does work, it's short term.
Yep.
And there's a lot of continued restriction down the line.
Yeah, like in the 1930s, it was a thing to take amphetamines, which were great for short-term weight loss. And then they stopped being good for short-term weight loss. And now amphetamines are illegal for a reason. There was a trend in the 20s where doctors would prescribe thyroid medication to healthy people just so they could lose weight. It goes right back up the second you stop drugging yourself.
Like, I think the most recent numbers is that it's a $59 billion industry. I feel like sometimes there's this kind of idea that it's this conspiracy of they don't really want you to know, or like they have the answer, but they're just not sharing it because they want more money. No, it's just because the dieting itself, that becomes the issue. Physically, there can be responses just in how your hunger hormones go up. Your fullness hormones are just kind of fullness thrown off. You can have less energy, you're moving around less as well. Your metabolism starts to slow and you're on that like in heightened deficit. And we know that a lot of times people, the people who I work with often, they have been on diets their entire life, multiple diets. And what do they all have in common? Similar things. And so what are we trying to do now? focus on those healthy actions and not focus on that weight piece, because where has that gotten us past several hundred years?
I think you talking about the effect of dieting and the fact that it always only works short term is so important to know, just as a concept. Like,
other than like a few unicorns in the dieting industry, that's what they're called, like here and there.
Yeah, like,
but,
yes, every once in a while, one person will find like their diet that works for them, but they are a statistical anomaly.
Even at that too, in my experience, what I have seen with people in that might be 5 to 10 years.
And do those people ever like stay at their new weight after they stop the diet? Because that's, to me, the test. Like, it doesn't count as a diet if it has to be for the rest of your life.
Right. You have that binge restrict cycle where a lot of times, if you think of that pendulum, people are, trying to restrict. The more they restrict, what happens a lot of times is that ball will drop and go the opposite side. And that kind of overconsumption or binging, not binge eating disorder, but just kind of binge in that moment, is something that a lot of people experience, when we could just kind of focus on being in the middle right there. And I mean, one of my favorite analogies is, if you think about a diet as if you were underwater trying to breathe through a straw, you're essentially getting diet air. And if you think about when you would come up outside of the water and have access to all of the air, you would probably have like deep breathing, right? Your body compensating for that, the minimal amount of oxygen that you were getting underwater with the straw. A lot of times you can kind of think of that in dieting, where that moment when you get out of the water and you're just kind of taking these deep breaths is kind of similar to somebody who is just getting off a diet and just wanting to eat whatever they can. That in the moment feels scary, and it feels very out of control, when it's really just your body doing what your body needs to do, getting in more of that nourishment, kind of like with the oxygen, getting in more of that oxygen. If we can stay there and figure out, kind of work through that, then a lot of times that kind of oxygen intake, your body's not going to need that much. You're going to go into more balanced, normal kind of intake. Same thing on the food side. It's not going to be this kind of overwhelming, out of control feeling thing. And unfortunately, though, that kind of intake is scary. And so they'll go back underwater to get that diet air again, or go back on that diet, versus just kind of working through that piece. And that can take a long time, depending on how long somebody has been dieting.
The more you diet, the less you are able to control. It's not really a practice makes perfect situation. It's the opposite. It's a deprive yourself of a necessary ingredient to a healthy brain, and your brain will stop working right. One of my other special interests is cults. Food restriction is actually a tool that a lot of cults use to make people more pliable, more malleable. And so you see it again and again, that people who fall too far into cults will often have like really restrictive diets, because it makes them a super pliable person, and it kind of takes away their agency. And a diet is kind of a person doing that to themselves. Like, by dieting, they are kind of inhibiting their own agency. So it not working and it leading to weight cycling is just brain chemistry at a certain point. And I think there's so much victim blaming, especially attached to weight cycling, because it's like, oh, well, you were doing so good. Why did you like fall off the wagon? And it's like, no, it was your body fighting back and your brain breaking. That was going to happen.
The heightened place where they were getting all of those compliments was probably the worst place to be.
Yeah.
Yeah. Diets themselves are very culty. I mean, I know in particular there's that focus on the documentary regarding a diet cult, but I've always thought of diets as this kind of culty thing outside of that too, outside of anything tied to religion, because they kind of lure you in with the sense of community. And there's one way of doing something, and there's one way, or that would be the one way of eating, and teaching you that kind of everyone else is wrong. Just kind of stick with the process. It's the only way to eat, and bad things will happen if you stop, if you get off of the plan, if you get off of the diet. And the whole sense of community, I mean, that's a big part. That's a really a part of mourning when people are stepping away from diet culture, stepping away from dieting. They don't have that kind of club involvement. And so I know there's more to cults, and that we can just even talk about. I mean, you can talk about the bite model, even Stephen
Yeah.
Hess's bite model.
I mean,
But
diets are behavior control.
yeah, I see diets as cults, and that's not anything new.
And to me, like, every diet is that behavioral control.
Yeah.
The information control, thought control, and emotional control, that to me is what varies. I would say a lot of diets definitely fall under it. I know that some are much more, to me, it
And
depends
if you're
on,
thinking like Mediterranean diet, like that's
Yeah.
just not going to be it, but
Yeah.
like a specific kind of fad diet, essentially.
Oh yeah. I
Yeah.
think diets are a spectrum that range from like healthy lifestyle to you only eat cheese once a day.
Right.
Right.
Right. So we need to just have more conversation about that, and not just see Gwen's diet cult as like the only cult. There's a lot more.
Nutritional guidance varies wildly across the industry and seems to change every year. I definitely have trouble keeping up. And people with lifestyles need different diets to remain healthy. So, Kat, is there something I'm missing? Like, how,
Yeah.
what is the one thing that everybody should follow that I like? Why does it keep changing?
Right. So kind of a trick question almost there, of like, what is the one thing that they should follow? So really that point that you made, that there's different things coming out, what seems like constantly, of contradictory nutrition recommendations. When we are able to read those articles, and I don't mean journal articles most time, like news articles, and follow where they got that information, most of the time you'll find that's one study. It was a small sample size. The authors called for more information. Like, it's not going to be this kind of groundbreaking kind of change in nutrition implementation. And so when you look at the foundations and the principles, they're pretty consistent, and they have been consistent for a very long time. And so one of my favorite things to do with people is kind of going through all of these different kind of diets, fad diets, and look at what the similarities are. So if somebody is like feeling better on a specific diet, because sometimes I have people who will comment to me and say, I'm doing this and I've felt better, I have more energy. How can you tell me it doesn't work? And so with those, I really like showing the similarities. So most of the time they're going to promote more nutrient dense food. Yes, they're going to have some that are going to exclude certain types, but they're going to be generally nutrient dense foods. Most of the time they're going to encourage you to make your own foods, and eat out less. Most of them are going to encourage you to drink more fluids, to get more water in. Just kind of these basic foundations where if you look at all of them and see what they're similar in, you're like, oh, maybe those foundations are really why you're feeling better. It's not the specific diet itself. And we could have that same kind of feeling without those kind of restrictions. So As far as with what is, or the question of what is one thing that everybody needs to follow, something that whatever the food that is going to give them the adequate amount of nutrients and energy. Energy is just another word for calories, but to support their daily activity, their recovery, if they're depending on, what kind of physical activity, if they are doing any kind of physical activity, but just recovery in general as well. And then, just what is going to be enjoyable to them, looking at not just their taste preferences in a particular kind of food, but just on the broader scale, what is their kind of culture around food, and making sure that you don't need to have follow another kind of culture's food. You can have your own culture and keep that kind of food and have it be a very great nutrient dense way of getting in food. And so one of my biggest pet peeves is when there are more a wider variety of cultural foods that are just kind of pushed aside, and we focus so much on that, like chicken and rice and broccoli kind of thing, when there's so much more variety that we can have, so much more flavor and seasoning, and we don't just kind of need to have this kind of whitewashed almost health food.
Yeah, so I can still have cabbage sauteed in sesame oil, just like maybe use a little less sesame oil.
Depends on your needs.
Yeah. I'm still going to put a lot of sesame oil.
Sounds good. Sounds delicious.
I'll try to put less salt in it, but I probably won't.
Right. And that's even another thing too. If somebody is mostly able to make foods or eat foods from home, maybe they're not even close to reaching the amount. Maybe they're not even close to reaching the amount of the higher levels of intake for sodium, even with hypertension or blood pressure issues. What we know now is we're focusing more so on increasing potassium level. This is just kind of a side note, but increasing potassium levels to help with that sodium potassium pump versus that sole focus on reducing sodium. And so when we're increasing potassium levels, we are also increasing the amount of produce that person is getting too. And so it's kind of a more positive way, and I think more fun way of looking at that and implementing some changes with somebody, for example, who has issues related to that. If you had anything, even water, in an excessive amount, that would not be good.
Oh yeah, like you can drown.
Just diets in general, they are rooted in wanting to have that acceptance in society. They're rooted in admiration, respect in a fat phobic society. And so it's completely understandable for people to, again, not blaming the victim, it's completely understandable for people to want to go on diets over and over again. The concern is, though, it's just kind of bringing that up to their acknowledgement of how is that working for you, right? Like all of these diets, they've been different. They've all worked while they have worked, but long term, how is that working for you? And while there is that acceptance, there is thin privilege, 100%. There is respect. There is that admiration piece. What can we do? And this is really where people in the industry have, I think, a big ethical role in breaking down that fat phobic part of society. Infantilization. Yeah, you can even leave this in here. Because it's ridiculous on how we have this kind of like ideal weight, even in your early 20s, this kind of goal or ideal where you feel like you need to be the rest of your life, when our bodies are supposed to change. A 40-year-old body does not look the same. It should not look the same as a 20-year-old body. Like, it's normal, it's healthy to have that kind of change, and to expect us to stay at one ideal weight once we reach adulthood for the rest of our life is ridiculous.
Yeah.
Ad Astra, Ad Astra, to the stars, to the stars.